At this point in the course, we have talked so much about the different pieces individually, and it is time to start putting everything together. It is time to talk about tips very specific to the middle game. And well, hopefully this chapter helps reinforce everything that we have talked about, and it adds new concepts or at least a new perspective. So let's begin with this concept of the principle of the second weakness, of the principle of the two weaknesses. And this is something that to me is very interesting because not a lot of people talk about it. And I remember once talking to a friend of mine, already a master, and I bring this up and he didn't really connect. Maybe he already did it in his games intuitively, but it was not like something that really stood out to him, and he was like, yeah, I use it, or I teach it, or no. So with that said, what is the principle of the second weakness? Well, one thing that we know is that many times, and this happened to me so much for many years, I would learn about something like an isolated pawn, right? Okay, it's a weakness, you could put pressure on it, and then I'll do that in my games, and I'll do that for 20 moves only to end up in a draw because I couldn't convert. And then later I realized, or I learned, you know what? Many times one weakness is not enough. Like if you look at this position right now, black has an isolated pawn and white has done everything great. This is the player here as white is Botvinnik. And Botvinnik, of course, knows what to do. So he's putting so much pressure on that pawn. But guess what? Because it is only one weakness, the black pieces could defend it, bring all of the resources, everything is defended. So it wasn't until later that I realized, you know what? Once you have a weakness like this and everyone, all of the resources are there to defend it, if you want to win the game, you got to create a second weakness, ideally in another sector of the board. And this weakness could be in many different ways. For example, we could go back to the games that I have shown or the examples that I have shown so far. But if we go back to that game where Magnus was playing as white, remember that he won because his opponent had one weakness, which was the king was exposed. That's a weakness. But also, this passed pawn, which is an asset for white, it is considered a weakness for black. So black has one weakness, two weakness. This pawn is not like something they own, but the fact that the pawn is passed, it is a liability to them, right? So these are liabilities. You could also argue the light squares are just a weakness for them, right? So we got to create something else. Now, we saw in that game how the queen couldn't keep up with defending against this pawn, defending the bishop, and defending against the checkmate threats around the king. Now, in this example that we are going to look at, it is a little bit more complex than that. The white pieces realized my opponent has one weakness. They're defending it really well. So I'm going to create a second weakness in the form of weakening their king. I'm going to attack their king. And for that reason, the white pieces in this game played pawn to g4. All they want is to play g5 and expose the enemy king and attack it. With all of these pieces tied down to the little pawn on d5, and this is why I said in chapter 1, this is one of the downsides of having weak pawns. They require good pieces to babysit that pawn, right? Now, because those pawns, the black pieces are defending the pawn, we're not so concerned about anyone attacking our king. We're exposing the king a little bit, but their pieces are not ready to attack us. And in fact, if you remember the game where Kasparov also pushed the g pawn or opened up the g file, he eventually brought the rook over and created a powerful attack on the king side. So in our mind, if we create complications around this king, then black has to defend the king. So some of these resources will have to move over to the king side. And then that will be two weaknesses that they cannot keep up with. So after g4, we got queen to c6, pawn to g5, making contact, pawn takes, queen takes, and just like that, we got the g file. Again, sometimes this could backfire and get us in trouble, but we could, if we know how to, and we have the right conditions, we could use it to attack our opponent. So after f6, every time a pawn moves, weaknesses are created, and that's exactly what happened to the g6 square, right? So we go in there, closer to the black king. They kick us out, fine. They have the bishop to complement their pawn structure. Notice how this is pretty good. The black pawns are controlling the dark squares around the king, while the bishop controls the light squares. So that's good. However, queen goes back to g3, f5, and now queen to g5. So we keep putting pressure. This pawn is a target right now. This one is still being attacked heavily. And after queen e6, well, it is time to move the king over. And I hope you already understand what this is about. Just trying to bring the rook through the g file. So the rook goes from putting pressure on the d pawn, it's going to go over to put pressure on the g7 pawn, and of course the king with a checkmate threat. So queen e5, we bring the rook over, rook goes to f8, queen h6, not only adding pressure, but we're also putting pressure on another weakness on b6, you see? So b6 is a weak pawn, b5 is a weak pawn, and their king is not that happy with this situation. So rook goes back. Look at the black rook. The black rook just went to the king side. Now, because of the pressure that we're putting is going to the queen side, there's only so much they can keep up with, and not to mention the psychological pressure. When this person is playing as black, defending, they are keeping up with what's happening on the board, but the timer is also ticking, the energy is going. It's not the same when you are attacking, looking for beautiful moves, to when you are defending, sweating, probably burning more time. So after rook b8, we have rook h4. Now we keep creating threats. We're looking for this powerful moves. Our opponent is there. How do I defend? So easy to make mistakes. And I tell you, because I have been on both sides, I know what it feels like. So king f8 trying to run away, check, they block with the bishop, their pieces keep getting more passive, more compromised, and now this rook is not going to be doing much, so we bring it over to target the pawn on f5. It is pinned on top of it all. Rook b7, they're just trying to defend. Rook g5, both rooks go after the f5 pawn. We're not going after the d5 pawn, but we're going after the f5 pawn. Now, g6 is not even possible. I mean, it'll drop, but also the queen is hanging, so that would drop as well. Rook is coming over to help. Queen is coming back, just adding more pressure to that pawn. Again, g6 is not even possible. And after this check, well, we simply put the king in safety. All of our pieces are on the king side. And after pawn g6, well, happy to take. Brand new threat. We're also putting a lot of pressure on f5. And after bishop h7, well, we have so many options here to get out of the threat with check. And they chose to go queen to d6. Now, notice how we are enjoying this because we took action and we exposed their king. At the end of the day, the d5 pawn, we have not even gone for that pawn yet, right? Now, you might be asking maybe, after queen g6, what if they go rook to g7, we take on f5, that king has to move out the way, and then we could collect on g7. If they went bishop f7, for example, well, we pin it. It's just so many pieces. The white pieces have very good chances here, right? Now, again, in the game, after we took, bishop h7, queen goes over with check, rook goes to e7, pinning themselves. This cannot be good. Check. And then the black pieces simply resign because we even have this move coming over. Like, for example, we can see how bishop d5 finally takes the pawn, but it's not so much about the pawn anymore. It is about attacking that black king. And what began as one weakness on d5 was turned into a second weakness on the board when we began to expose the enemy king. So that's it. If there's something I want you to take away from this is, if you find yourself like it's happened to me in the past, I remember a game where I was on this game for like 2-3 hours, putting pressure on an isolated pawn. I remember it was the Philidor defense. My opponent played as black, and I couldn't convert. And back then, I didn't know about this second weakness. Otherwise, I would have said, okay, I got you here. Let me create a second weakness on another part of the board. So there you have it. Little by little, we keep adding. And this is just one of those many ideas and principles that we will continue to reinforce. All right, just to practice, we've talked about the second weakness principle. What's the move in this position? Just to reinforce, we already have a weakness on d5. How did botmanate create a second weakness? Well, of course, I hope that you already thought of this. Pawn to g4. And we're basically saying, now your resources have to worry about this pawn, but also about the attack that I'm going to start on that king. So after pawn to g5, finally the g file opens up. And after f6, queen to g6, it's just a matter of bringing pieces to attack that king. In this chapter also, I wanted to talk a little bit more about pawns, believe it or not. We already know pawns are the infrastructure of the board. They dictate our strategy. They tell us what files are open for our pieces to operate through. They tell us if there's any weak square that we could occupy. They tell us what side of the board we should play on. So of course, this is a never-ending story, just always paying attention to the infrastructure, to the pawns, right? Now, I wanted to begin by showing just two quick positions here. This one, for example, if we just look at it with the knowledge that we have acquired so far, you can see how this structure for black has weaknesses. There's a weak square on d6, the pawn from e is already moved, the one from c is already moved, so I can't spot this hole on d6, on f6, even on h6, and maybe right now I cannot do much, but I'm going to be paying attention to it. It would be great if I could put a knight on d6, or if I could put a bishop on d6, and these are just little things, little patterns that just like we got so good at tactical patterns, well, we're gonna get just good with these as well. Now, also just to illustrate this concept of the pawn chain, the pawn chain is telling us in this case that we have more space on the queen side. We should be attacking, we should be expanding on that side of the board. And of course, there's more to it. Because there's a pawn on d4, we want to make contact right there. So typically, you want to make contact in this locked position. I want to make contact with the pawn in front of my most forward pawn, right? So this is my most forward pawn. I would like to attack that one. And for that, I already know I should play c5. I'm not saying it has to be right now, but it's at least some guidelines that we can look at. It's not set on stone. It's not always, there are exceptions, of course, but this makes a lot of sense. Now, let's say c5 happens, c3 happens, pawn takes, pawn takes. Now we see this pawn on d4 that cannot be defended by any other pawn. Well, because of that pawn structure, we already have a plan. Simple, and maybe not the best, but it's a plan, which is putting pressure on that pawn, maybe bring this knight over to f5 to target that pawn, right? And this is why it's so important that we not only play our openings blindly, but we understand the why we play it the way we play it. So with that said, I think we will be talking more and more about it as we go through this chapter. And but I wanted to make sure that we reinforce these ideas that we have talked about already. Something else about pawns is that we have to be careful as we advance them, because as we advance them, they become more dangerous because they get closer to promotion, but also they become weaker as they go further away from the rest of our pieces, right? And with that said, let's talk about the mobile center. And in this case, we're referring to the pawns that we have on d4 and e4. These are two central pawns next to each other like we like them, but these are pawns that are mobile. We could push them whenever we want. Now, if we are the player with the mobile center, we want to time really well when we advance the pawns. For the most part, it's like when we talked about the hanging pawns. They're really good next to each other. They could get us, in this case, for example, a pass pawn. But we know when that pawn becomes a pass pawn, it also becomes an isolated pawn. So I want to time it right. I want to activate pieces because I have so much control over the center. I want to activate pieces to attack. And the most important thing, I believe, is to just not get ahead of ourselves. If you are playing against the mobile center, like in this case, the black pieces, well, you want to make sure that you want to be careful with that pawn advancing and creating threats or becoming a pass pawn. But more than that, you want to be putting pressure on those pawns. You want them to either move prematurely or you want them to fall. But definitely we want to put pressure on those pawns. Now, simple concepts, but I think it's a good addition to what we have already discussed regarding pawns, pawn structures, and so on. So this is more specific to the center, but at the end of the day, it helps to have this information. This next example, I think, is something you're going to appreciate because even though we have talked about it, how to convert an advantage, how to take this position and win. Well, you're gonna see it from different angles in other examples, including this one where Kramnik again gives us a masterclass. So when we're ahead, we have an advantage. We want to, of course, improve our pieces. If we are ahead in materials, simplify the game. We want to gradually improve our position. And of course, limit your opponent or eliminate, don't give your opponent anything, no counterplay for your opponent. Now, in this position, Kramnik is playing as black. And as you can see, not only does he have a pawn majority, 2 versus 1 on the queen side, but it also has a very powerful knight on c3. It has pressure on that pawn on a2. So how do we convert this? I can see myself making mistakes, ruining it, but Kramnik immediately starts to bring the pawn up, not only to protect that pawn on before, but we're getting closer to promotion. You know that this 2 versus 1 could turn into a pass pawn, which could promote or at least provoke our opponent to give us a piece for it, right? So after a5, we got queen to b3. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm ahead, or if I think I have a very easy endgame, like in this case with the 2 versus 1, I'm not gonna hesitate to trade queens. So the closer I get to the endgame, the more powerful my pawn majority will become. Of course, you have to see the next move in order to play queen takes b3 with confidence. And the next move is a reminder that we don't need 25 pass pawns to make it to the end. If one pass pawn makes it, we already have an advantage, we have the win, right? So in this case, after g5, the bishop goes to g3, because remember, that bishop is attacking our pawn on e7, so we don't want to lose a pawn, which would create a pass pawn for them, protected pass pawn, but also the bishop would get active, helping on the other side. So after g5, bishop g3, now pawn to a4. This is the follow-up, the true follow-up to queen takes queen. Now, after a4, we're sacrificing the pawn. Of course, rook takes would lose their rook to the knight. But if b takes a4, it didn't happen, but if b takes a4, the passed pawn is just too close to promotion. It is going to be protected by the knight, so this would be very easy. Again, I don't want both pawns to be safe, just one. If I unlock this pawn, I'm going to be fine. Now, after a4, the white pieces played knight to d2, just bringing pieces to defend, and now we simply create a protected passed pawn. So this is a pawn now that is 2 squares away from promotion. It will always be an asset for us, a liability for the white pieces. Now, rook to c1, and of course, it would be great if we could do some sort of discovery and get the rook, but that's not happening. So next move, pawn to e5, another strong move, another pawn sacrifice to get to open up files. My rook wants to participate, and if this pawn is gone, I could do it through the d file. So we've been talking about the knight, the rook, the bishop, and you can see how all of this together can turn a small advantage into a win. So after e5, b5 was played, and it makes sense. White is saying, I'm not going to open up the file. I got myself a pass pawn, so you better be careful. Now, once more, if they had taken, we can simply go rook to d8. Let's say the knight goes to c4, and then after rook d1, simplifying the rook that's stopping me from promotion, the game is just too easy now, right? Now, and of course, if they had taken with the bishop, well, we take with the bishop, and the same thing happens when the file opens up. Now, in the game, d5 is played. Then we go, we go pawn to a2, pass pawn, pass pawn, pass pawn. They block it. Our knight is still defending it. It's not like we just sent it, and it's hanging, right? And this is something that I mentioned a moment ago. Our pawns, as we push them, they become more dangerous for our opponent, but they also become weaker. They're far away from our pieces, so we have to always keep that in mind. Now, after rook a1, we got pawn to e4, and guess what? The bishop on the long diagonal is now open to help out. So once more, I'm trying to remove my knight so that I can hit the rook, which is the one piece blocking my passed pawn. So pawn to d6. Now, rook to a2. I need to move the knight so that the bishop hits the hits the rook through the long diagonal, but I don't want to lose the pawn, right? So we're defending it. Yes, they have a passed pawn, but everything is controlled. And after knight to c4, finally we have a chance to move the knight out of the way, hitting the rook, and the white pieces play bishop e5. Now, take a moment if you want, pause the video, see if you can think of the strong move that Kramnik played next. And the move was actually very, very nice. Knight takes pawn. There's no more pass pawn for the white pieces. And of course, if they take with the bishop, we get the rook. If they take with the knight, well, we take the bishop and we're hitting the knight, we're hitting the rook. In this game, they simply gave the rook for the pass pawn, which is one of the things that we wanted, right? The other thing they could have done, I think, it's bishop takes g7. We simply take on c4. And then let's say they go, I don't know, bishop d4. Well, our knight could go to d2. The pawn is going to fall. And this is just too much. Anything else? Well, if they just take, we take. And then the b pawn is going to go as well. This is just too easy. Again, in the game, we have rook takes a2, we take, and then now we have bishop, bishop, rook versus knight. And after we take on f2, this is just too much. Check. Then we have this check on e5. I mean, of course, the knight is controlling it, but pay attention to how we could switch diagonals. And then simply after rook b1, that pawn is going to fall. The black pieces should convert this easily. So there you have it. Another example where we see a strong player like Kramnik convert a position. It always comes down to the same things: simplify, reduce your opponent's counterplay, and the one thing that we cannot deny is that sooner or later we need to rely on tactics. So it is important that as we learn more strategy and more chess in general, we keep doing our tactics. Our tactical eye needs to be ready for when the position is or the conditions are ready. So with that said, we keep on going, we keep reinforcing all of these important strategic and positional concepts. All right, time to test if we are paying attention. In this position, what's the best continuation? What was played here by the black pieces? Well, of course, we reinforce this concept of just getting one pawn to the end. We just need one pawn to become passed and promote. And for that reason, a4 was the move, sacrificing the pawn, because then after b3, the pawn is going all the way. Another quick position here, we have in this position, the black pieces have a passed pawn already on a2. It is defended by the rook. This bishop wanted to help, but it's blocked by the bishop. Bishop e5 was actually the last move played by white. What to play here? Well, reinforcing, we have the knight takes d6, very difficult tactic to find. And then, of course, if they take with the knight, we take, and then we hit in the bishop. Pawn is ready to promote. If instead they take with the bishop, well, pretty straightforward. And then if they took on g7, well, we take the knight. If they take, we take back and the b pawn is gone. And of course, if they simply move the bishop back, well, it's a matter of time before we take on b3, end of story. In the game that we reviewed, they actually played after the beautiful move knight to d2, white simply gave the rook for the pawn, took on d6, and the game became very, very easy to win after this, right? The pawn is falling, and we have a good position. So there we have it. There we have it. We have to keep testing you, make sure that we are all on the same page and we're just not seeing it and then forgetting it. We keep at it. We keep at it. Another very important element in chess is the ability to evaluate a position. And once we evaluate a position, then we can actually formulate a plan. Now, a few things that we look at when it's time to evaluate a position, we look at king safety, so whose king is safer, and depending on that, I could come up with a plan. Like if my king is exposed, definitely a very important plan is to put my king in safety. If my opponent's king is exposed, maybe my plan should be to go after that king and attack it because it is exposed. King safety, we also have Of course, material. Am I ahead in material? Am I behind? And an easy plan that we've talked about already regarding material is if I'm ahead, try to simplify the game. If I'm down, try to complicate the game, right? Also, pawn structure. We have talked so much about pawns and pawn structure. Are there weak pawns, doubled pawns, isolated pawns? And then, of course, very important piece activity. Whose pieces are more active? Whose pieces are more coordinated? And a plan based on that could be, hey, maybe you have a knight that is all the way on the edge. Well, your plan or part of your plan could be relocate, bring that knight, improve that knight's position, and it is a valid plan. It is a valid maneuver. So, with that said, let's put it into practice. Let's take a look at a position where Capablanca, third world champion, was able to win a game because of his ability to come up with a plan. Capablanca, he had this style that he would make chess look so simple. And in this position, for example, the main thing that stands out is the white bishop. It is trapped. It has no mobility whatsoever. We have talked about the bishop. We know when the bishops are good, when they're not so good. And in this case, it has no future. Now, we cannot say this bishop is the best bishop, right? I mean, it's not the greatest bishop in the world, but it's definitely better than this one that cannot play anytime soon. So the plan, according to Capablanca here, is do whatever you can to reinforce your pawn's position on the king side so that this bishop never comes out. The other part of the plan is this is looking more like an end game. There are no queens, only a few pieces left. So it's a good idea to activate the king. And after that, we want to create another liability for our opponent. So one liability for white, the principle of the second weakness is this bishop unable to participate. And then this them being basically down a bishop, I want to play on the other side of the board with my bishop. And then if I have 1, 2, 3 pieces playing on the queen side versus 2, I should have an easy game. Now, Capablanca, many times he would mention this ideal position, and he has helped me a lot. From this position, this is my ideal position where my pawn is on f6, my king is on e6, my rook goes to the queen side, and I start pushing pawns and opening up lines to activate my bishop. So with that in mind, the next move for Capablanca was pawn to f6, very simple. It opens up the king to come over, and it reinforces his pawn's formation on the king side. So king to g2, pawn to a5, just starting to operate on the queen side. And again, black is thinking, you know what? Without your bishop participating, you're basically down a piece. You're basically down a helper. So pawn to a4, taking advantage of this hole on b5. The king is coming over. This is first phase of the plan. We already secured the pawn structure. Now activate the king. That part is complete. Now we go to bringing the rook over to the queen side. Notice how white is also trying to clear the king side to activate the bishop, but black simply doesn't have to react. We don't have to take, we don't have to do any of that. And this bishop simply cannot come out. There's just no way. So after rook b8, they took. We simply take back. We don't want to leave the pawn there for them to take it. And the bishop, again, cannot come out. If they play f4, we could take it. End of story. So we got now pawn to b3. Not a big deal. We're going to go pawn to c6, and this is the beginning of the final phase where we're going to play, not the final, but the next phase or the next stage of the plan, where we're going to start opening up lines on the queen side. So we need to play c6 and then b5. So now we got rook to a2, pawn to b5. Finally, we strike. And the moment these pawns clear up, at least a little bit, my bishop will activate as well. It should be a pretty easy game for the black pieces. Now, the rook comes over. He went over to the king side to try to free their bishop. They couldn't. They bring it back because things are about to open up. And of course, with the conditions met, with our pieces active, so piece activity, we're going to open up. We already talked about rooks, and rooks need open files to penetrate into enemy territory. So after pawn takes, we don't have to take on b5 right away. We could do an in-between move, hitting the rook, hitting another pawn. And if you think about it, this is just a doubled pawn that I have. So happy to take. When they take back, pay attention to how this pawn became an isolated pawn. It is not next to the other friendly pawns. So that's going to be a target. So after rook b5, not only do I defend my own isolated pawn, but I'm putting pressure on the b3 pawn. So rook a4, give me the pawn. It already fell, and I'm hitting the other one. Pawn to d4, no problem. Rook to b5, defending my pawn. Rook to c4, and now Capablanca goes rook to b4. Remember, I'm already up a pawn. Happy to simplify, and if they say no, I'm gonna take this pawn on d4, right? So they took on c6, I took on d4, and for all I know, I have a passed pawn that I could push with the help of my rooks and my bishop. I have an extra bishop if you think about it, because this one never participated and it never will. And because of that, the white pieces simply resigned. That's it. You could again take this position, play it against a friend, against the computer to see if you can convert, but it should be about pushing the pawn, simplifying the position more if you could. If you get rid of the rooks, that's it. And again, just a simple plan that I am very able to mess up, or at the very least just draw and not win. But Capablanca made it look so simple. And after you've seen this over and over and over through multiple different games, then it will become second nature to you as well. So again, we keep putting all of these concepts that we've learned together, and I hope it's not frustrating or distracting. I hope it's actually a good opportunity to, again, reinforce and put everything together. So with that said, let's keep on going. Let's keep on going. Another time to practice and to test you a little bit. So this comes from the Capablanca game. And how do we continue? What's the best way to take advantage of the fact that we have an extra piece? If we split the board in half, we can see how black has 3 pieces on the queen side and the white pieces have only 1. And one of these pieces cannot even come over to help ever to the queen side. So of course, Capablanca played pawn to c6, wanting to start to open up lines for the rooks to get more activated. So after rook a2, b5, rook goes to a1, and then finally we broke the queen side open by playing c4. They took, then we hit on b3, forcing them to create an isolated pawn for themselves. And then after rook b5, we defend their pawn, we attack their pawn, and it's just a matter of continuing to convert, give me the pawn, then back to defend, offer the trade of rooks. They said nope. Well, they take ours, we take theirs, and then with the extra pawn, which is a passed pawn, the extra bishop, we have a very easy endgame to convert. Another question that I get asked often is, okay, what do I do in those quiet positions where there's nothing happening? How to approach them? Well, we gotta ask the great Karpov again. And we're gonna take a look at this game that is basically Karpov versus Kasparov, right? Now, very interesting because we all know Kasparov, his style was more aggressive, more tactical, and then Karpov was more technical, quieter. So seeing a position like this, seeing Kasparov playing a position like this, I can imagine him being a little bit uncomfortable. Doesn't mean that he doesn't know how to play it, but he's not playing that kind of position that he enjoys the most, more dynamic, with more attacking chances, and so on. Now, a few things before we continue from here. When it comes to quiet positions, it's just little things that you already know. We want to be patient. It's a quiet position. You don't want to get ahead of yourself. So be patient. Improve your position gradually, which means be patient. Keep your opponents, be careful with your opponents' counterplay. So keep him at margin. That's also very important. And then the other thing that you already know, which is the same thing with the same thing, be open to transitioning into an endgame that you know how to convert, an easier endgame to play, right? So in this game, we see how Karpov plays h3, quiet move, h5, pawn to a3, just preparing. We want to improve our position slowly. No one is attacking us, so no rush. Very important as we continue. Black has, I hope that you took a moment to evaluate the position, an isolated pawn on d5, the IQP. Also, this bishop, even though it defends the IQP, at the end of the day, it is a bad bishop. It's a bishop that is blocked by its own pawn. And if you compare it to the white bishop, you can see the difference, right? So as we continue with g6, pawn to e3, pay attention to how this e3 move not only defends the rook and controls the square in front of the isolated pawn, we talked about this, but it is slowly putting, along with a3, it is putting more and more pawns on the opposite color to this bishop so that it never bothers us. And it's also opening up lines for our own bishop. So little details. At the same time, we have talked about this. Because we only have one bishop that controls light squares, these pawns being on dark control dark squares. Very, very important. So king to g7, the king is getting ready for that endgame where the king needs to be activated. King h2, rook to c4, we don't have to react to this right now. So bishop f3, f3 improving the bishop, pawn to b5. Notice how b5 could be an attempt to expand on the queen side, maybe even to play b4. But at the end of the day, this is just another pawn getting on the same color as the bishop. We see this pattern again. It's just pattern recognition at the end of the day. So king to g2, getting closer to the center, rook c5, and now we take on c4. So little by little, now that Karpov improved his position, his bishop is a little bit better, his king is a little bit better, his pawn structure is a little bit readier for that endgame. Now he's taking on c4. Of course, d takes c4 allows rook to d6, so it would open up the file for the rook to penetrate. So they didn't want to fix the pawn structure. Instead, they took with rook to c4, and now rook to d4, right? So immediately we activate the rook. We welcome this trade because we transition into an endgame where we have our pawns on dark squares. The black pieces have a bad bishop and their pawns are on the same color of that bishop, so it's just horrible. And of course, the isolated pawn would always be a target. So after king f8, that king is coming around. It's an endgame. Bishop e2 we're telling the rook, hey, what are you going to do? And Kasparov took on d4. So just like that, with the rooks gone, we got bishop at knight versus bishop at knight, but the pawn structure is much better for white. Now, after king e7, the king keeps being activated. We have knight to a2, maneuvering the knight. Guess where that knight is going next? Well, there's a weakness on a6. I wish I could be on b4, so I'm going around. Knight a2, bishop c8. That bishop goes from bad to worse. This is its home square. That's where it came from initially, just to defend another pawn. Horrible. And as I say horrible, I can tell you, I have been here myself, so I know the feeling. Knight to b4, improving the knight. Then pawn to f3, very important move to keep this knight also away from improving, right? So we control that square. Yes, notice how we're putting our pawn on the same color of our bishop, but hey, you have to, it's a trade-off. You keep the knight away, but you also make your bishop a little bit worse. Now, with that said, your bishop is still way better than the enemy bishop, right? So after knight g8, trying to reroute it, h4, notice how that pawn goes to a dark square, and now your king doesn't have to defend it no more. Then knight to h6, the king comes over. I hope this move came to you pretty naturally, centralizing the king. Knight f5, attacking the pawn. Well, the next move, it has to be pretty straightforward too. Knight goes back to c2 to defend. Don't give them anything. And then after f6, we go bishop d3, and I hope you begin to see what Karpov wants. After pawn to g5, then obviously we're going to take on f5. It's not what we take, it is what we leave on the board. And it makes a lot of sense to eliminate this knight, leaving the black pieces with this bad bishop. So after we take and they take, knight to e3, we have a knight that could attack all of those pawns that they have on light squares, while the bishop cannot attack any of our pawns. And to make things even better for the white pieces, after bishop e1, we play pawn to b4. Not only keeping our pawn on dark square, but we're fixing their pawn structure on the same color as this bishop. Little by little, we improve the position, we make it easier to convert. So pawn takes. Now, pause the video if you want, see if you can find the next move that Karpov played. I personally here, I would have just taken back, simple. But the thing is that if we do so, it won't be easy for this king to come over and penetrate. They put the bishop on g6, next to the pawn, good luck coming in, right? So Karpov being Karpov, this is the difference between Karpov and the rest of us. Instead of taking back like anyone would, he played knight to g2, and he's sacrificing the pawn basically because he knows the king is going to get it back, because he knows this one is falling. It's falling after knight f4. So h takes g3, king takes g3, and the pawn is just going to fall, right? Now, if they had played h3, this is a question that you might have. Well, knight f4, falling, and of course, we can always play king g2. It's just not going anywhere. So again, beautiful move, knight to g2, pawn takes, king comes over, fork. There's nothing they could do. It's not like this person is bad and walked into a fork. Kasparov knows what he's doing. It's just that the pawn on g6 is falling no matter what. Give me that. Then check again. Activate the king. And notice how this king is now is about to cross into the black piece's camp. Bishop c2. The bishop has not much to do at this point. King is coming in. Then they're putting pressure on f3. Well, we're not going to go back to defend. Take that one. I'm going to take your f6 pawn. And then we have 3 more pawns on the board. My knight and king should be able to collect those pawns. So king g6, they defended it. But d5 is falling. It's just too many weaknesses. And we have the powerful knight that could hit both the pawns on light squares and the pawns on dark squares. So fork. And then give me another one. There we go. I'm going pretty fast here because at this point, everything is collapsing. King f5, king f4, attacking the bishop, and just in time to defend on e3. King to c4, going for the pawn on a3. Knight goes back. You're not coming in, my friend. Then knight to d3. Knight to e5 check. Knight goes around. Knight goes around. And finally, we're looking for that square, hitting the king, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn. And of course, they don't want to give you the bishop. So bishop g2, but now another one falls. And that's knight takes b5. That's it. Now we got into this endgame where after knight d6, the black pieces simply resign, because even if they took on a3, we have 2 passed pawns that they simply cannot stop. They might be able to sacrifice the bishop for one of them, but not for the 2 of them. And that brings me to a final point here, which is we talk a lot about simplifying when we're ahead as part of our plan to convert. But you gotta make sure that you trade down pieces, knights, bishops, rooks, queens, not pawns. If you trade too many pawns, you might end up with no pawns to promote, or only one, and they'll be happy to give you the bishop for that final pawn, and then you cannot checkmate. Like imagine this pawn is in here, and they give you the bishop for the other pawn. One knight and one king cannot do checkmate. So that is something very important to keep in mind. And here we are again, just testing before we move forward, just to make sure we are understanding what's going on. In this position, for example, the black pieces went king to d6. How should we continue? Pause the video. I'm not going to give you any more hints. I'm not going to ask anything else. Pause the video, see if you can come up with the next move and understand the why behind it. Well, the next move is about keeping the enemy knight away. Don't give him any counterplay. Don't give him any good squares. And of course, a potential square for the knight is e4. So pawn to f3, problem solved. We don't have to worry about that anymore. In fact, the next move in the game was knight to g8, just going back, trying to reroute into a different square. So there you have it. Next position, also very important. After the bishop comes over to b1, how do we continue? What move can we play to pause the video if you want? How do we continue? Pause the video, try to think about it and understand the why. If you still couldn't find it, well, the question is, with my opponent having a bishop and having all of these squares of all of these pawns on the same color, I want to make sure those pawns remain fixed on the light squares, just like the bishop. So the move pawn to b4 fixes these two at least in place. They're not gonna go anywhere. And at the same time, the bishop not only has less squares on the board because of its own pawns, but it's also, like, I continue to put my pawns on dark squares so the bishop would never be able to attack them. So very simple idea. Oop, let me just make sure that I'm not missing anything. Yeah, very simple idea. And now we have the final position where, well, we have to determine how to react to g takes h4. I personally, I always say it, I don't think I would ever find this move in the game. It's just so counterintuitive. But Karpov, instead of going with the flow, instead of just taking on h4, he played the brilliant move knight to g2 to be able to get to the h5 knight. If they took on g3, no problem, we take. That's what happened in the game. And then the knight went for the h5 pawn. Even if they hadn't gone king e6, that pawn on h5 is falling. And then, of course, if the pawn goes to h3, well, we attack both. The king is going to take care of it sooner or later. Like right now, we could just take it. So little details that make the difference. We could play a beautiful game for so many moves, get to this endgame, make one mistake, and then everything goes away. So it's very important that we stay accurate, that we give ourselves times, and that we double check before we move, especially endgames. If you make a mistake, there's no time to come back around. That's it. In the middle game, maybe you make a mistake and you have a lot of moves to turn things around and find another opportunity. In the end game, it's almost the end. And if you miss your opportunity, you might just not see it again. I want to wrap up this chapter just by really making a point about this concept of strategy versus tactics. Just remember, tactics refers to a short sequence or short-term sequence where we're going to end up acquiring an advantage, right? So we put the sequence in motion, quickly forcing, we get an advantage. Strategy, positional chess, is more about long-term planning. And the truth is that however you want to look at it, they're very related. And sometimes we could use, like you've seen so far, strategy to create the right conditions to execute a tactic later, or you could use tactics to get a positional or strategic advantage. And this final position or this final example is very short, very simple, but I think it's going to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So this is just a very well-known opening. It's called the Russian defense or Petrov defense. And after 95, pawn d6, the knight goes back, we take on e4, so we get the pawn back, d4, d5, and it becomes a very symmetrical position almost, especially after bishop d3, bishop d6. But notice how the black pieces have the knight in e4, right? Protected by the pawn. The game continues with castling for both sides, pawn to c4, already challenging that pawn in the center because it's the pawn defending the knight. Black pieces defended with a pawn. And then after queen c2, knight to a3, white pieces go knight to c3, which is not a good move because it allows the tactical detail knight to b4. And of course, simple at the end of the day, but it's a fork. And because of that fork, we're going to be able to eliminate one of the white bishops. And that gives us a small strategic advantage, which is the bishop pair. Now with the bishop pair, with everything that we have talked about, you should be thinking, you know what? If I could, I'm going to open up the board. If I could get rid of all of these pawns, it would make my bishops much happier. And then I'm going to try to maximize them. I'm going to try to connect those bishops with other long-range pieces like the queens to create battery or the rooks. And just like that, you have a simple plan. At least you know what you're looking for in the game. And little by little, we get deeper into these concepts and we become much stronger players. But one thing is for certain, as you move along, you're gonna hit plateaus. And in my experience, some of those plateaus are because a lot of people, they're fascinated by tactics, opening, memorization, and they never learn strategy or positional chess or endgames. And sooner or later, they will need those skills. And you don't want to wait until the last minute to add that. So I'm not saying go full on strategy and positional chess, but definitely little by little, add to it, review this course, go back at it again until these concepts become second nature to you.